Chapter 45. The Volatile Ella. Ella, you need to convince Mr. Edward to let Mandy continue staying at the orphanage. She's only making $3,000 a month, and her rent is $2,000. It's way too expensive, she said. Ella lowered her eyes when she heard this. The basement is only $300 a month. How can she live in a basement? The director exclaimed. It's so chaotic there. Yes, not only chaotic, but the residents are complex. At night, you have to repeatedly check that the door is locked before you dare to lie down, and you can't sleep too deeply because the slightest noise outside will wake you up. Going to the bathroom at night feels like going to the execution ground. Do you know why I know this, director? The director stammered. Why? Because 8 months ago, after you kicked me out, I lived in the basement. The director's eyes widened in shock. Why didn't you tell me earlier? If you had come to me, I would have given you money. Ella lifted her gaze, feeling a bit warmed by these words. The director had never married or had children, so she had always treated Ella and Mandy like her own daughters. The orphanage only provided 9 years of compulsory education from charitable organizations. Both she and Mandy had attended university, thanks to the director's support. The director's monthly salary was almost entirely spent on the two of them. She had often told herself that when she grew up and earned money, she would definitely take care of her. 8 months ago, when they had kicked her out, the director had even secretly given her $1,000. But none of this was enough to justify bypassing Mandy. She wasn't a saint. So, she looked the director firmly in the eye. Director, I'm sorry, I can't help with this. After saying that, she took Sophia's hand and walked forward. Ella. The director's voice turned stern. Ella paused in her tracks. The director spoke with heartfelt words. You and Mandy are sisters. You've grown up together since childhood. I know she wasn't good to you before, but it was all for the sake of the orphanage. What grudge, what hatred makes you treat her this way? Ella, you are being too much. You are also too disappointing to me. Ella clenched her fists tightly. In the director's eyes, Mandy could do no wrong. What was she, Ella, worth? She didn't speak and continued walking forward. Her eyes instantly reddened. Her heart ached fiercely, and her throat felt choked. Sophia tugged at her sleeve. Ella, don't cry. Director Mom doesn't trust you, but I do. That one sentence made her unable to hold back her tears, which streamed down her face. She wiped her tears with her sleeve. Then, after a sob and a wipe of her nose, she spoke firmly. Yeah, who's crying? Come on, let's go eat a big meal. To celebrate that you're now my sister. Sophia immediately nodded. The slender girl, holding the hand of a slighter child, walked forward. Inside the Rolls-Royce, Mr. Edward's gaze upon them grew complicated. Over these days, he had seen so many sides of Ella. The Ella who had kissed him impulsively the first time they met. The clever Ella who had outsmarted Andy. The courageous Ella who had jumped from the 2nd floor for a little girl. Chapter 46. You must agree to a condition. And then there was today's Ella, who was not welcome at the orphanage. The Ella who was a mistress with no sense of guilt. So many versions of her made him wonder which one was the real Ella. As he drew closer and understood more, he found that the girl had a mysterious aura, both righteous and devious, like an enigma waiting to be unraveled. Ella took Sophia out for a meal and then led her to the Edward family residence. Standing at the grand entrance, she hesitated. She had adopted Sophia out of anger with Mandy, but now, where would she place Sophia? As she pondered, the butler approached her, glanced at Sophia, and said, "The master has instructed that Miss Sophia will stay in the Nanchang Pavilion for the time being." The Nanchang Pavilion was where her mother had lived. It was very reasonable to place Sophia there. But the master's instruction? She rolled her eyes. Mr. Edward had helped her at the orphanage today, and now again. Ella turned to the butler. Is the chief at home? The butler nodded. Ella quickly patted Sophia's shoulder. Sophia, follow Sam to look around the courtyard, I'll come see you later. Then she dashed towards the villa. She ran all the way to Mr. Edward's room and stopped. After hesitating for a moment, she saw a maid bringing tea. Her eyes lit up, and she quickly took it. Let me. Then she pushed the door open and peeked inside. Mr. Edward was sitting behind his desk, looking like he was reading documents. She tiptoed in, closed the door quietly, and approached Mr. Edward step by step. She poured him a cup of tea and placed it in front of him. Mr. Edward didn't even look up, picking up the tea with his long fingers, taking a sip, and then placing the cup aside, continuing to read the documents. Ella stood there, staring at him. At home, he had taken off his jacket and was only wearing a white shirt. Sunlight streamed in, enveloping him in a halo, making him look exceptionally noble and imposing. Just sitting there, he was like a static ink painting, aesthetically pleasing. Ella couldn't help but stare in a daze. How could there be such a handsome man in this world? As she was lost in thought, the man seemed to finally notice the intense gaze in the room. He looked up calmly, and upon seeing Ella, his gaze deepened. "What are you doing here?" His cool, deep voice brought Ella back to her senses. She blinked her big eyes, stepped forward obsequiously, and refilled his cup of tea again. "Chief, thank you for today." Mr. Edward nodded, "MHM." Ella thought. Isn't it normal for him to say you're welcome here? Why did this man always break the rules? Now, with just an MTM, how was she supposed to continue the conversation? However, Ella was always thick-skinned, so she immediately cleared her throat and continued, "Chief, I know you're the kindest. Since you've helped me once, could you help me again?" Hearing this, Mr. Edward moved his hands away from the documents. He looked up, his dark eyes fixed on her. "I can help you, but you must agree to a condition." Chapter 47. Chief, give me a hand, will you? Huh? Ella was shocked. "I haven't even told you what I need help with, and you're already setting conditions?" Mr. Edward, expressionless, extended a finger and tapped the desk. "Isn't it about Sophia's schooling?" Ella, how did you know? She had come here specifically for Sophia's schooling. Sophia was already 12 and had been attending elementary school in the orphanage. Now, she definitely needed to find a place to continue her education. And this matter could only be arranged with Mr. Edward's help. Was this man a mind reader? She hadn't even mentioned it, yet he had already guessed. But he had just said he would agree on one condition. Ella immediately became wary. The condition can't involve anything illegal. Mr. Edward frowned. Ella instantly felt like she was marching to the execution ground, and she put on a heroic stance. "Chief, go ahead and state your condition." Seeing her look, Mr. Edward felt both annoyed and amused. Yet, he spoke seriously. "You must not do anything that would harm the reputation of the Edward family." Ella was momentarily stunned. Had she ever done anything to harm the Edward family's reputation? She widened her eyes. Her? Seeing her feign ignorance, Mr. Edward pushed back his chair and stood up. His tall and robust figure made the room seem instantly cramped. Ella stepped back under his overwhelming presence. Mr. Edward took a step forward, then another, closing in on Ella. "Are you pretending to be clueless?" His tone carried impatience. Ella, however, was completely bewildered. Feeling him step closer, the cold, domineering aura of his was now inches away. Ella swallowed hard and stepped back again. Her leg, still bandaged from the injury, had been painful whether going to the orphanage or returning, limping all the way. Stepping forward was manageable, but stepping back. A sharp pain surged, making her leg give way, and she began to fall backward. Ella widened her eyes and frantically reached out. Just as her hand was about to grab Mr. Edward's arm, a memory of their first meeting flashed in his mind, causing him to step back immediately, avoiding her grasp and not catching her. And so, thud, Ella landed heavily on the floor. Even though the floor was carpeted, the impact still hurt, making her massage her rear while grimacing. "Chief, that's not very nice of you. I'm an injured person, couldn't you have helped me up? Ouch, my rear hurts so much, I think it's going to burst." She groaned with a pained expression, looking quite pathetic, which left Mr. Edward somewhat speechless. He looked down at her. "Aren't you getting up?" Ella looked up, her expression pitiful. "Chief, my leg is badly injured and can't exert any strength, and now my rear is hurt too, I can't get up." "Chief, can't you help me up?" Mr. Edward looked at her, then thought of the girl's helplessness at the orphanage today, and softened, extending his hand. And then, suddenly, the girl grabbed his wrist, pulling with great force, dragging him down to the ground. Chapter 48. Even Stephen. Mr. Edward could have steadied himself. But seeing her leg injury, he hesitated. Just that moment of hesitation was enough for him to be pulled down, landing right beside Ella. He propped himself up with both hands on the carpet, squinting at Ella. Ella hopped up on one foot, moved her injured leg a bit, clapped her hands, then looked at Mr. Edward, her playful smile replaced by a serious expression. "Chief, I agree to your condition." With that, she lowered her eyes. She had thought Mr. Edward didn't believe Mandy, but now it seemed he still held a grudge from that night 8 months ago. Her heart felt like it was pricked with a needle, a sharp pain spreading. She gave a self-deprecating smile. "What's done is done, I can't change it. But from now on, I won't tarnish the Edward family's reputation." Having said that, she turned to leave. But with her injured leg, she was limping, and now her foot slipped, causing her to slide backward. Struggling, she managed to turn in mid-air and landed right on Mr. Edward. And then, by sheer coincidence, her lips lightly brushed against his. Both froze. The soft, warm touch felt like an electric shock, jolting through Mr. Edward, making every cell in his body come alive and sensitive. The contact, even through their clothes, felt the girl's warmth and a faint, familiar scent. Mr. Edward was stunned, shocked. Ella wasn't faring much better. She stared, wide-eyed, at the man's face, magnifying yet still flawless. The cool sensation on her lips felt like a feather lightly brushing, making her heart race. She blinked a couple of times, then heard the man's gritted teeth. "How long do you plan to stay on top?" Ella frantically tried to get up. However, due to her leg's inconvenience and increasing panic, her hands searched helplessly for a support point. Mr. Edward. He refused to admit he was somewhat distracted by her touch. A blush crept up his ears. The next moment, Ella fell back onto him. They were tangled together, inseparable. Mr. Edward couldn't stand it anymore. He reached out, supporting Ella under her armpits, ready to lift her up, when suddenly he felt what was in his palm. At the same time, Ella's face turned bright red. Somehow, she found the strength to push herself up and back away, shielding her chest with her arms, indignantly shouting, "Pervert!" "Mr. Edward!" Mr. Edward simply sat on the carpet, initially feeling annoyed, but then found her reaction amusing. He straightforwardly said, "Even Stephen." "Ella, does that mean she had touched him that day?" The atmosphere suddenly turned awkward. Chapter 49. Who got the short end of the stick? 2 people, one standing, the other sitting. Ella was clearly looking down at him, but this man, even in his casual seated posture, exuded an air of arrogance that bordered on disdain. Clearly, she was the one who had been taken advantage of, so how could he act as if he had the upper hand? Ella couldn't help but purse her lips and mumble under her breath, "How did we even things out? Clearly, I'm the one who got the raw deal." But the room was too quiet, and her soft murmur was clearly heard by Mr. Edward. He lowered his gaze, braced his hand on the floor, and stood up. Unable to resist the urge to tease after the girl's prank, I quipped, "Such a small chest, where's the harm in that?" "Ella, you." She glanced down at her own chest. Well, it was a bit small, wasn't it? But admitting that now would be too weak. She boldly declared, "I've got a B cup." Mr. Edward didn't say a word, just gave her a dismissive glance, but his eyes clearly conveyed, "Are you sure? This guy doesn't do much, but his inner monologue is endless." A single glance could make Ella go ballistic. She directly retorted with a cold laugh, "I think I'm the one who got the short end of the stick." Then, she casually glanced at a certain part of the man and muttered, "A needle." Mr. Edward. His face instantly darkened. The conversation had taken a distinctly risque turn. Yet, in the midst of the flirtatious atmosphere, this woman's words infuriated him. Seeing his cold gaze, Ella shrank her neck in fear. She realized she had made a mistake. Why did she say something like that to challenge a man's dignity? Under Mr. Edward's piercing stare, she coughed lightly, her eyes darting around. "I suddenly remembered Sophia is new here and might be a bit unsettled. I should go check on her." With that, she made a move towards the door. But just as she took a couple of steps, her wrist was suddenly grabbed by Mr. Edward. In the next instant, with a forceful pull, She was slammed against the wall. Then, the space before her darkened as the tall figure of the man pressed closer. He braced his hands against the wall behind her, trapping her within his arms. He slightly lowered his head, just enough to see the top of her head. The silky dark hair brushed lightly against her face, deepening his gaze with a sudden urge to do something. "What did you just say?" Ella was already terrified. The scent of his pheromones filled her nostrils, making her gulp in fear. She widened her eyes, staring at him. If she dared to repeat those words, this man might just kill her on the spot. Ella stuttered, "Big Chief, I was just kidding. How could you be a needle? You're heroic, experienced, and still full of vigor." She babbled on with words she didn't even know she was saying, finally looking at him timidly. "Is that okay?" I've run out of adjectives. Mr. Edward." He suddenly felt that tonight, he was being a bit childish. Why was he bothering with her like this? Especially with that mention of Chief, which made him feel a bit uneasy. But why it bothered him, he couldn't quite put his finger on. He furrowed his brows, stepped back, and released her. The girl was like a caged bird set free, immediately darting out excitedly. "Then Chief, we've agreed, Sophia's schooling is on you, and I'll fulfill my promise to you." Mr. Edward stood in the room, watching her limping away, his eyes filled with unfathomable emotions. Chapter 50, Alexander's Strange Attitude. After dashing out of Mr. Edward's room, Ella leaned against the wall, catching her breath. The situation had been really dangerous. It felt as if she couldn't breathe. Especially when Mr. Edward moved in, her heart was pounding as if it would burst out of her throat. Why did she provoke him when everything was fine? Shaking her head, Ella calmed herself down before heading towards the small courtyard. Sophia's enrollment in school wasn't something that could be sorted out quickly, and with summer underway, there was no rush. For now, she would be staying in the small courtyard. Wondering how she would get along with her mother. Before she even reached the courtyard, she heard the cheerful laughter coming from inside. It was Sophia's voice. Ella was taken aback. Stepping in, she saw Sophia planting flowers with her mother. As her mother explained the types of flowers, Sophia listened intently, occasionally chiming in, "Wow, really? Auntie, you know so much." They seemed to be getting along quite well. Ella was surprised and felt a sense of relief. After watching them for a while, Ella decided to go back to her room to rest. After all, her leg injury wasn't fully healed, and after the chaos at the orphanage, she was extremely exhausted. She said goodbye to her mother and Sophia and headed towards the main villa. Just as she left the courtyard, she suddenly noticed someone standing at the gate, peering inside. It was Alexander. She raised an eyebrow, noticing the unconcealed smile on Alexander's face. His gaze was still on her mother, his eyes soft and comforting, his square face exuding a kind of doting affection. Ella was a bit puzzled. The first time she met him, Alexander had shown blatant hostility towards her, leaving no doubt that he didn't like her. She had assumed that Alexander's relationship with her mother must be strained, but this seemed not to be the case. Curious, she stepped forward and greeted Alexander. "Hello, Uncle." Alexander seemed to notice her presence, pulling his gaze from her mother to her. His expression hardened into the cold, detached look she was familiar with. He nodded slightly. Ella, feeling a bit puzzled, politely asked, "Do you want to come in?" Alexander frowned. "No need." And with that, he turned to leave. Ella found this a bit odd, pondering over it when Alexander suddenly stopped and looked back at her. "Since the Edward family has taken you in, you'd best behave. Andy has a bad temper, you should endure it." It was clear that if Andy were to bully her, she was expected to bear it. Ella felt a surge of indignation. She might have been an orphan, but she had never been looked down upon like this in the orphanage. The Edward family was wealthy and influential, but did they really need to belittle her so? Mr. Edward had told her not to disgrace the Edward family, and now Alexander was telling her to tolerate Andy's bullying. Was she just supposed to take it? She bit her lip, watching Alexander's retreating figure, and suddenly called out, "Uncle." Alexander stopped, turning back with a displeased look. "What is it?" Ella pursed her lips, asking, "Uncle, if you all dislike me, why did you bring me back?" Chapter 51, Something's Wrong. Alexander furrowed his brows upon hearing this. Ella, however, stared him down with a determined air, as if she wouldn't let it go until he clarified his statement. Alexander gave a cold smile. When the time is right, I'll tell you naturally. Ella. Is this statement implying that they brought her back for a purpose? But what exactly is that purpose? She furrowed her brows, just in time to hear a voice call out from not far away, Alexander. Turning to look, she saw Mila walking quickly over. Upon seeing Alexander, her gaze fell on the entrance of the small courtyard, her eyes flashing with a sharp glint. She approached with a smile, like claiming ownership. She linked her arm with Alexander's and said, "You've come to see your sister again?" Alexander nodded. Mila sighed, "She's such a good person. I wonder when her illness will get better." Alexander immediately frowned, his eyes showing concern. "What did the psychiatrist say?" Mila replied, "The doctor said this illness can't be rushed. It has to be gradual, especially considering the severe trauma she experienced back then." Hearing this, Alexander's eyes dimmed. "It's all my fault for what happened back then." Mila caught that expression. His words also made Mila's eyes widen slightly. She squinted, turned to look at Ella, and changed the subject. "Ella, have you been settling in well at the Edward family?" Ella gave Mila a sidelong glance, sensitive to the woman's emotional shift. It seemed she didn't like her mother. But then again, which daughter-in-law would like their husband's sister? Ella didn't dwell on it, responding politely to Mila's courteous inquiry with a nod. Mila then smiled. "Good, if there's anything you're not used to, let me know. If you need anything, also tell me." Ella nodded again. Mila then supported Alexander and left the area. After they left, Ella walked towards her room. After a long afternoon nap, she woke up to the butler calling her from outside the door. "Miss Ella, it's dinner time." Ella groggily opened her eyes and stared at the ceiling for a moment before realizing it was already dark. She stretched, stood up, and walked to the door, opening it. The butler was standing there. "The family is already in the dining room, waiting for you." Ella nodded. "I understand." As she was about to head downstairs, she suddenly paused, turning back to the butler. Where's Chief?" The butler didn't understand her question. "Mr. Edward is also in the dining room." "Also in the dining room?" Thinking about the confrontations they had earlier over the airport and needle issues, encountering each other at dinner would be quite awkward. Ella coughed, addressing the butler. "Butler, I suddenly remember, I want to have dinner with my mother today. Please inform them to go ahead and eat. I'll join my mother." Her mother, due to her mental condition, had been living in a small courtyard, separate from the main household. Having said that, she pushed past the butler and headed towards the small courtyard. She thought to herself, it was truly unfilial. She had been home for several days and hadn't even had a meal with her mother yet. But when she entered the small courtyard, she immediately felt that something was off with the atmosphere. Chapter 52, Cold Meals. Dinner time should have been filled with joy and the fragrant aroma of food in the room. Yet now, the courtyard was unnaturally quiet. Ella entered the room to find her mother already asleep on a small bed. Sophia, on the other hand, sat wide-eyed at the dining table, staring blankly at the dishes in front of her. Ella walked over and tapped her on the shoulder. "Sophia, what's wrong?" Sophia snapped out of her trance. Seeing Ella, she hesitated. Ella was puzzled. "What is it?" Sophia bit her lip, pointing at the dishes on the table. Ella looked over. There were 4 dishes and a soup, all beautifully presented, but cold. She quickly said, "Sophia, you don't have to wait for my mother, you can eat first." Sophia immediately shook her head. "It's not that, Ella, it's..." "What is it?" The food they brought over was cold, icy cold. Ella was stunned. "Icy cold?" "Yes, not just cold, it felt like there were ice chips in it." At this, Sophia used her chopsticks to sift through the food and indeed picked out a piece of ice. Ella was shocked. "What's going on?" Sophia looked at her. "I inquired with the auntie. It turns out she's been eating such cold meals every day. And I always felt the food was a bit strange." "Strange?" Ella picked up her chopsticks, took a piece of fish, and put it in her mouth. As it was frozen, the fish tasted cold and faintly odd. It tasted like it had picked up flavors from the refrigerator. But the more she tasted, the more she felt the strange taste was like it had gone bad. Ella narrowed her eyes at the fish. It looked decent, but the taste left much to be desired. She thought of something, quickly picked up the fish dish, and walked out. There were 2 rooms in the small courtyard, one occupied by her mother, the other by the nanny, a woman in her 30s. Ella entered and saw the nanny eating. Looking over, Ella noticed the nanny's meal was 2 dishes and a soup, all steaming hot, emitting a savory aroma. She immediately frowned. Seeing her, the nanny's eyes first showed a hint of panic, which quickly subsided. She stood up from the table. "Miss Ella, what brings you here?" Ella stared at her meal, asking, "Why is my mother's food cold, but yours is hot?" The nanny replied with a forced smile, "How would I know? Our small courtyard doesn't have a kitchen, the food is brought over from the main house." Meaning, was this all under Mila's instruction? After all, Mila managed everything in the house. Ella lowered her eyes, unsure of the situation at home. It might not be wise to confront Mila directly. She thought for a bit and found a compromise. "How about this? I noticed there's a gas line by the courtyard. Let's turn it on and heat up these dishes." Upon hearing this, the nanny reluctantly pouted, so demanding. Can't even eat in peace. Thinks she's a true Edward heiress, so finicky. Chapter 53, Let You Taste. Upon hearing this, Ella's brow furrowed sharply. An overwhelming pressure suddenly emanated from her. The nanny jumped, startled, but then felt amused, wondering what she had to fear from this woman. She plopped back down on the chair. "The job I was assigned is to take care of that lunatic, except for meals. Since I'm not responsible for feeding her, you can sort out the gas pipe and all that yourself." "I don't care." With that, she picked up her chopsticks and resumed eating. Ella glared at her. Her fists clenched tightly. Seeing the nanny's neglect towards her mother, she realized that her mother's days in the Edward family might not have been as pleasant as imagined. True, a lunatic couldn't complain, and even if the nanny mistreated her, no one would know. She bit her lip, then after a while, gave a cold laugh. "Very well, very well." With that, she turned and walked out. As soon as she stepped outside, she saw Sophia rummaging around in the kitchen. Ella walked in and immediately smelled gas in the room. She was startled and called out, "Sophia." Sophia turned around, her forehead smeared with ash, looking dirty. Her little hands were also dirty as she spoke to Ella. "I'm trying to figure out how to use the gas pipe. So I can heat up meals for Auntie later, you don't have to worry." Those words tugged at Ella's heart. Sophia was indeed a particularly warm-hearted girl. However, Ella stepped forward, patted Sophia's shoulder. "No need, we won't be heating anything today." Sophia was taken aback. "If we don't heat it, how do we eat?" "But we can wait until the ice melts a bit, then it won't be so cold." Ella, however, narrowed her eyes and curved her lips. "No need, wait for me here, I'll go ask what's going on." Just as she was about to leave, Sophia grabbed her arm. She turned to see Sophia's anxious face. "Ella, if you go to ask, will they kick us out?" Seeing Sophia's cautious demeanor, Ella reached out and patted her head. "Don't be afraid, leave it to me." Then she went into the room, packed the dishes from the table into a food carrier, and limped forward with it. Ella directly entered the dining hall of the villa. Before she even stepped in, she could hear the cheerful laughter inside. She stood by the door, peeking in. Mila was serving Andy with his favorite dishes, while Alexander was laughing, not sure about what. On the other side, Mr. Edward sat there, exuding a sense of detachment, out of place among the family of 3. As Ella observed, Mr. Edward seemed to sense something, suddenly looked up, and upon seeing Ella, he raised his eyebrows. Ella stepped in. As soon as she entered, the laughter in the room ceased abruptly. Andy stared at her. "What are you doing here?" His tone was harsh, carrying dissatisfaction. Ella curved her lips, stepped forward, and her gaze fell on the dining table. The abundant and nutritious dishes contrasted sharply with the meager leftovers she had brought from her mother's table. She lowered her eyes. "I'm here to add a dish for everyone. There were leftovers from my mother's meal, so I brought them over for you to taste." With that, she didn't bother with anyone else, directly taking out the dishes with ice fragments from the food carrier and placing them on the dining table. Chapter 54, What do you think? Seeing those dishes, Andy's eyebrows knitted together. "Ella, what are you doing? These dishes just taken out from the fridge, How can we eat them? And who in our family eats leftovers? What are you causing a ruckus for? Can we even have a peaceful meal now? Ella remained silent, her gaze fixed on Mila. Her expression showed no surprise upon seeing the dishes, indicating she was fully aware. Ella let out a cold laugh. This was my mother's dinner tonight, she didn't even get a chance to eat it. Alexander exclaimed in surprise. What? Immediately, he turned to Mila with a questioning look. Mila, as if ignoring Alexander's gaze, suddenly stood up, appearing even more agitated than he was. What is going on here? Who arranged Ella's meals? Butler Toby. With this loud reprimand, Alexander's expression calmed down. Butler Toby, who managed the household's meals, hurried in, bowing respectfully. Master, madam, what is your command? Mila pointed at the dishes on the table. What is this? I repeatedly told you to take good care of Ella. Is this how you've been taking care of her? You'd better give me a reasonable explanation. Ella turned her head to look at Butler Toby. Butler Toby maintained a composed demeanor. Ah, that's the matter. He sighed. Sir, do you remember, half a year ago, when Madam accidentally scalded herself while eating, you instructed that we should not serve her too hot meals? We consulted the doctor, who said it's okay to eat colder meals, so ever since then, Ella's meals have been served cold. Alexander seemed to recall the incident and nodded in realization. Ella found this absurd reasoning laughable. Because they were afraid her mother might burn herself, they gave her cold meals. How dismissive could they be? She pointed at the dishes on the table. Not only are they cold, they're frozen. Since the doctor said it's fine, then Butler Toby, you should eat these dishes. Butler Toby was taken aback. This. How come Butler Toby is unwilling to eat these dishes, yet they're given to my mother? Does my mother's status at home not even match up to Butler Toby's? Butler Toby finally felt the fear, sweat beading on his forehead. Ella looked at Alexander. Uncle, aunt, I've heard of servants overstepping their bounds. Such things must not happen in our family. Big brother, don't you think so too? Alexander furrowed his brows. Mila stared at Butler Toby, weighing the pros and cons. Mr. Edward, who had been quietly eating as if uninvolved, raised his eyebrows upon hearing the girl's final words, looking up. The girl was clever. Everyone could guess that the meals must have been a directive from Mila. But merely with the meals, it was insignificant to Mila, so instead, she directly pointed the finger at Butler Toby. Her aim was clear, and it would also alert the household staff to be cautious and not neglect Ella in the future.